Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, host of Kinda Murdery, a podcast that's about more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories. The unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Hey there. As it says in the intro, I am Zevin Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. Thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed our last episode, Campfire Stories with my daughter Daisy. It was a lot of fun to record it with her, and knock on wood, all Odelberg family members are now recovered from COVID-19. Thank goodness. I hope this episode finds you and your loved ones also well. Today's murder comes our way from a series of Washington Post Sunday features during the spring of 1914. In total, it's the sprawling story of the busting of a Cosa Nostra counterfeiting ring, as told by William J. Flynn, Chief of the U.S. Secret Service under President Woodrow Wilson. But to tell you the truth, I had trouble wrapping my head or my attention span around the intricate details of a years-long funny money investigation. So, we're going to focus the scope of the inquiry a bit and zero in on the contents of a wooden barrel with a coat thrown over it. A barrel left at the corners of Avenue D and 11th Street in New York City. So please do join me now as we uncover what truths we can and solve what mysteries we may. Kinda Murderies, Petto the Ox and the Alphabet Barrel Murder starts now. Mrs. Frances Connors left her little room in an East Side tenement house early on the morning of April 12, 1903, to go to the bakery for rolls for breakfast. Mrs. Connors was a normal woman and thereby endowed with a generous share of curiosity. Just a reminder, this is the story as told by William J. Flynn, head of the Secret Service in the early 20th century. I'm going to go ahead and let him tell the story, and so take any comments and editorializing he happens to do, such as all women are curious, in the proper historical context. I'm sure you will. Alright, back to the story. As Mrs. Connors passed in front of the New York Mallet Works at Avenue D and 11th Street, she noticed a barrel standing near the curb. An overcoat was thrown over the head of the barrel. It was a decent-looking coat, not ragged enough to be thrown away, and Mrs. Connors' curiosity grew. Why should anyone, even a wealthy person, throw away an overcoat which was not worn out? She paused in her walking and regarded the barrel. Her interest increased. It had been drizzling all night, yet the overcoat was scarcely wet. It couldn't have been lying there very long. She glanced up and down the street. No one was in sight. Perhaps the coat was placed there to keep the contents of the barrel dry. Well, that was strange to use a coat for such a purpose. There would be no harm in gratifying her curiosity. Mrs. Connors stepped to the barrel, lifted a corner of the garment, and peered in. A cry of terror broke from her lips. She dropped the coat back over the grisly thing she had seen and staggered, pale and shaken, away from the barrel. Other people had seen her strange actions. In a moment, a little group, also fired by curiosity, collected. The frightened woman stammered out what she had seen. Someone ran for a policeman. An ambulance was sent for, and the crowd grew. Meanwhile, a policeman arrived and drew the body of a man from the barrel into which it had been jammed. When the ambulance surgeon arrived, he announced what everyone had already figured out. The man was dead. A strip of gunny sack had been wound around his neck, hiding a dozen wounds, any one of which would have caused death. The neighborhood was in a panic. The police department was at sea, and the entire city of New York was agog, and all of this before Mrs. Connors even recovered from the shock of her discovery. At the Union Market police station, it was determined that the man had been dead at least 2 hours. He seemed about 40 years old and well set up. His complexion was swarthy, and his ears were pierced for rings, after the manner of many Sicilians. His clothing was of good quality, and from his general appearance it was judged that he was not a laborer. His forehead was high and receding, covered with thin curly hair of a light brown tinge, his mustache streaked with gray. On the left cheek were 2 old scars which formed an inverted letter V. That's V as in Victor. Photographs of the man were made promptly and compared with the pictures in the rogues gallery at police headquarters, but the victim was not to be identified that way. The police investigation of the circumstances of the crime was pushed to the utmost. Every detail of the man, his clothing, and the barrel was recorded. It was determined that at least 2 weapons had been used by the murderer or murderers. A wound directly below the left ear had been inflicted with a narrow, 2-edged blade, and the incision was 3 inches deep. It takes a strong wrist and a heavy lunge to drive a knife in so far at that point. A wound above the Adam's apple, which penetrated sheer to the spinal cord, had apparently been made with the same weapon. There were numerous similar wounds of little account, but a deep gash across the throat, literally from ear to ear, had evidently been made with a heavier and more clumsy knife. All of these observations resulted in nothing. A search through the clothing of the dead man put a number of details in the hands of the police. The most striking object found was a small brass crucifix, the like of which is not often seen, and which, to my knowledge, was common to no one in particular locally. It was of a foreign make, and bore a Latin motto on the scrollwork above the figure of the Savior on the cross. At the base of the cross was a skull and crossbones. Since that time I have come across the same type of crucifix. In the dead man's overcoat were 2 handkerchiefs, one small and delicately perfumed, but the only identification mark on the clothing was Burt & Co., opposite Produce Exchange, stamped on the shoes, which were well worn and had been patched. Stenciled on the bottom of the barrel were the letters W and T, and on the side G233. It had evidently contained sugar, and in the bottom was a layer of sawdust mixed with the burnt stubs of cigars and a quantity of onion peel. Also there was a note in the handwriting of a woman. Part of 2 lines were legible, and the Italian words Giorni che venite, subito la urgenza could be made out. The translation is, and by the way, apologies because I'm sure my pronunciation was awful, but the translation is, day that you come, ... illegible, suddenly the urgency. So again, Giorni che venite, subito la urgenza. That's the Italian, and the legible part of the translation was, day that you come, suddenly the urgency. Inspector George W. McCluskey, then chief of the Detective Bureau of New York, took personal charge of the case and directed the work of his men. Every art known to the police was employed. The entire uniformed force was put on lookout for chance clues, and photographs of the murdered man were distributed in the hope that some policeman would recognize him. None did. The shoes were so worn that any marks of identification by which Burt & Co. might have determined to whom they were sold had disappeared. The handkerchiefs told nothing. Not a pawnshop in the city had sold a crucifix similar to the one in the possession of the murdered man, nor had any of the regular dealers in such articles. The markings on the barrel led to no discovery of value. The letter, which was regarded as perhaps the most promising clue, turned out to be only tantalizing. 6 more words unobliterated, perhaps only a single word, might have told so much. Now there was a tendency on the part of many to attribute the crime to a woman, or at least to find a woman in the motive because of the letter. However, as the identity of the victim was not established, there was no woman toward whom suspicion might point. Of all this I of course being William J. Flynn, head of the Secret Service, read in the evening papers. I was at the time watching in New York a band of Sicilians whom I suspected of certain crimes of which I shall treat later. Many of you probably know, but the Secret Service has 2 main purviews. Of course, one being the protection of the president, the physical protection of the president and at times other key government officials or their families. And the second one is the protection of the integrity of the American money supply, meaning rooting out counterfeiters. Chief of the Secret Service William Flynn continues. In short, as long ago as 1903, and this article of course being written in 1914, I, Director Flynn, was convinced in my own mind of the existence of a Black Hand organization, Black Hand being what we today might refer to as the Mafia or Cosa Nostra, The Godfather, The Sopranos, etc. From descriptions of the murdered man, and from photographs, it seemed to me that I had seen him before. Now we're back to the storytelling and observations of Director Flynn. I could not quite place him, and yet I was certain that I had seen the man. I shut myself up with a cigar and pondered the matter. The murder was brought to my attention on April 14th. Only 2 nights previously, the band which I had under surveillance had exhibited unusual activity. On the night of April 12th, I was in the possession of sufficient information in regard to this band to feel justified in making a personal expedition into their stronghold. In other words, he had enough information to feel like he ought to go to New York. Of course, in 1914, they like to say it a little more flowery-like. I was in possession of sufficient information in regards to this band to feel justified in making a personal expedition into their stronghold. He could have said, I had some info about this mafia group that made me feel like I should go to New York, but there you go. Certain of my men playing the part of thieves had gained the confidence of some of the lieutenants of Lupo and Morello. Lupo the Wolf, and Morello were leaders of this mafia group, and I, Director Flynn, was shaping up evidence enough to arrest them on, here you go, a charge of counterfeiting. So yep, the reason the Secret Service is looking into the mafia is because they are suspected of counterfeiting. On the evening in question, I picked up the trail of several members of the band and followed them from their counterfeiting headquarters in the cafe at Elizabeth and Princess Streets to the butcher shop of Vito De Luca in Stanton Street, east of the Bowery. The Elizabeth Street Cafe was just around the corner from Ignacio Lupo's saloon, that's Lupo the Wolf, one of the mafia leaders, in the rear of which Giuseppe Morello conducted a restaurant. In Vito De Luca's meat store, I saw Morello, who I had arrested 4 months before with a gang of counterfeiters. Morello had been acquitted, though all the others were convicted. 2 other men present at the store were Antonio Geneva and Domenico Pocarero, both of whom I knew well as members of the band I was watching. These 3 men stood in the rear of the shop in animated conversation, and while they talked, a 4th man, whose face was strange to me, stood alone on the sidewalk, near the door close to the flickering glare of the streetlight, smoking. The 3 men were evidently arguing, and presently they hung up a piece of bagging as a curtain at the door to the street. I knew the men were still talking behind the curtain when a covered wagon stopped in front of the shop and 2 men left it and entered the store. One of them came out almost immediately and drove away. Shortly after 8 o'clock, the visitors to Leduca's place left. They divided into 2 groups. The stranger went toward the Bowery with Morello and Pecoraro. All this on the evening of April 12th. Now, as I sat smoking and pondering the whole thing 2 nights later, the feeling grew that the stranger I had seen in the little butcher shop and the man who was found in the barrel might be one and the same person. Yet the pictures did not seem to portray the same features exactly as I remembered them, and the suit of the dead man was described as blue, while I remembered him to be clothed in brown. Of course he might have changed his clothes before meeting his death, but this didn't seem likely. I couldn't eliminate from my memory the covered wagon I'd seen 2 nights before. It seemed to possess me. Finally, I gave up on finding the reason for its presence and the unusual conduct of the drivers. The more I thought, the more I believed that the means by which the dead man had been transported from the place where he met his doom to the pavement on Avenue D was in that wagon. The men were Italians and associates of the Black Handers. Then again, the fact that the men in Leducas had been afraid of being seen and had hung the bagging over the glass door, and the stranger standing apart on the street just outside the door where he could not hear the talk, all strengthened my suspicions that the man in the barrel was the man I had seen. I knew much of the inside working of the gang, and I felt in some way that the stranger had incurred the hatred of the Black Hand. The murder was not within my province, yet I wanted, if possible, to solve it, partly for my own satisfaction, partly because every fresh fact I learned regarding the organization I was after could be used to my advantage. It was in a peculiar, slanting ray of light that I had seen the stranger, and I determined to reproduce, to the best of my ability, the same lighting effect, and make certain of the man before committing myself. Accordingly, I went to the morgue and viewed the body in the same kind of light in which I had first seen the face. I was no longer in doubt. The dead man was the stranger of Leduca's butcher shop. To prove this, rather than just knowing it, was a different matter altogether. Several of my men went with me to the morgue. We measured the body according to Bertillon methods. Still, the man had not been identified, nor did his measurements correspond with any record in the Bertillon files. Just a moment. I'm curious what Bertillon methods are, so I'm going to Google it. Here we go. The Bertillon method, developed by Alphonse Bertillon, was a system used to track and identify suspects and criminals. Police use special instruments to take precise measurements of a criminal's arms, ears, nose, trunk, head, face, feet, and hands, as well as standing height, sitting height, distance between the fingertips, and arms outstretched. It's no longer used. The flaws seem somewhat apparent. In particular, it's really only relevant for grown men who have reached full physical maturity and have short hair. But it was in use in 1914, so they tried it to no avail in this case. Despite no matches in the Bertillon files, I was positive I was correct in my statement and that I had seen the man as described. But I was troubled by the fact that the clothing was blue instead of brown as I had seen it. Finally, with the aid of my men, I rigged up a light in my office such as I had seen the man standing near on the night of April 12th. At the same height, anyway. The clothes were brought from the morgue, and under the light, sure enough, they looked brown instead of blue. I was then sure I was right, and the man had been a victim of the Black Hand. I at once notified Inspector McCluskey, and his men, working in conjunction with certain of mine, arrested 11 of the gang. They were Giuseppe Morello, Ignacio Lupo, Massino Genova, Vito La Duca, Pietro Inzerillo, Domenico Pecoraro, Lorenzo Libido, Giuseppe Fanara, Lorenzo Libido. What kind of name? That's quite a name. It's like Michael Vick's alter ego when he goes to Italy. Instead of Ron Mexico, he's Lorenzo Libido. In addition to Lorenzo Libido, there was Giuseppe Fanara, Giuseppe Lalamia, Nicola Testa, that's almost Nikola Tesla, whoa, Nicola Testa, and Luciano Perino. All of these men were Sicilians, and most of them, when arrested, were armed with knives or revolvers. On Morello, the police found a .45 caliber revolver and a knife tucked in the waistband of his trousers. A cork fixed on the point of the blade prevented it from scratching his leg, and allowed him to bring it into play with a single motion of the wrist, much more readily than if he had carried it in a sheath. Luciano Perino, known as Il Bove, or Tommaso Petto the Ox, carried a pistol in a regulation holster and a stiletto in a sheath. Most of the men arrested were in possession of permits to carry revolvers issued by the Police Department of New York. It was this roundup of desperate men, most of them armed, which did much to bring about the passage of a law forbidding the carrying of dangerous weapons. Now, while it was established beyond reasonable doubt that the man whose body was found jammed into the barrel was the stranger I had seen in Vito De Luca's meat shop, we were still at a loss to identify him. The 11 prisoners were taken to the morgue, and each one separately was confronted with the murdered man and questioned as to his acquaintance with him. When Morello, whom I had seen walking with the murdered man, viewed the body, he showed not the slightest sign of recognition or of agitation, though my Secret Service men and police detectives watched him as an animal does its prey. He shrugged his shoulders and volunteered the statement, "Don't know." Domenico Pecoraro, whom I'd also seen with the victim when he left the butcher store, was similarly as loquacious. In other words, he wasn't. He shrugged his shoulders as only an Italian can and varied the formula by muttering the words, "No understand." The other 9 prisoners denied all acquaintance with the victim of the murder. None of them had ever seen him, they said. We then hoped that relatives or friends would claim the body and thus establish the victim's identity. But for all we could tell after days of waiting, he had died without a single friend, with no relative to care whether he went to Potter's Field or not. Potter's Field being where they would bury impoverished people in unmarked graves. The police redoubled their efforts, but to no avail. Every clue, and there were few enough of them as it was, led to nothing. Each new line which was run down to no purpose, and all left the case more baffling. Joseph Petrosino was at the time in the Italian squad of the New York Detective Bureau. He received an anonymous letter telling him to keep off the case and describing the murder as a vendetta, which seemed to the writer of the letter sufficient reason for the barrel crime. Petrosino showed this letter to me. Here was a clue worth following. The writer was evidently afraid to divulge his name even to the police out of fear of the vengeance of the terrible Black Hand. I knew of no man so well qualified to handle the case as Petrosino himself, so after carefully thinking out a plan of procedure, I suggested that he go to Sing Sing prison, where several of the Lupo Morello band were serving terms for counterfeiting. Petrosino took with him a photograph of the barrel victim and showed it to several of the convicts whom he knew to be identified with the Black Hand. They too professed ignorance of the dead man's identity. It seemed as if it was to be the same story over again. But at last, Petrosino showed the photograph to Giuseppe de Prima, and without telling him of the murder, asked him if he knew whose likeness it was. De Prima glanced at the detective and alarm showed on his face. He clutched at the pasteboard on which was the likeness of the murdered man. "That is Moreno Benedetto, my brother-in-law!" he cried. "What has happened?" And if you'd like to find out what really happened in the case of Petto the Ox and the Alphabet Barrel murder, well, you'll have to rejoin me, and I sure hope you do, this Thursday, August 17th, for Part 2 of Petto the Ox and the Alphabet Barrel murder, only on Kinda Murdery. Thanks for being with me. I look forward to spending time with you again on Thursday. Until then, I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.